Arthur, thank you for being here.
Hi, good to be here.
Yeah. So, what got you researching or being interested in researching about housing and housing-related issues in New Zealand and elsewhere?
Well, there are a number of angles. I suppose, as you mentioned, I come from a macroeconomics background originally, so house prices is a very important part of the transmission mechanism for monetary policy, so I was always interested from that angle. But I really got more interested in it when I started doing more work on well-being and people's lives. And housing, it became clear to me, was a major issue in New Zealand in terms of people's poverty and issues of inadequate income, basically. Because housing in New Zealand, when we looked around the world, it turned out to be very expensive compared with other places. And for poorer New Zealanders in particular, it became really clear that it was one of the major causes or markers of poverty. So if you've got an interest in well-being, as I do, housing became sort of central to that, thinking about how can we improve people's well-being by changing things in the housing market.
So you touched on quite a lot of angles. Can you outline like a few areas that you researched on?
Yeah, so the first work I really did on housing at a city level as opposed to the macroeconomic level was a project I did on housing in Auckland, and it was commissioned by an arm of what was then Housing New Zealand, Centre for Housing Research, and they wanted to look at what the problems were with the housing market in Auckland. And it was one of the first studies, I think, really to concentrate on the difficulty of creating new housing supply in a growing city in New Zealand. Auckland clearly has been growing fast over time because of immigration, both from other parts of New Zealand and especially internationally. But it was slow to bring on new houses to house these people. And just basic supply and demand in economics tells us that if the demand is going up and supply is going up a lot slower, then prices are going to go up. And that's really what we saw in Auckland. So then we had to get behind, okay, what were the reasons for this slow supply response? I mean, we knew why the demand was there, because of immigration, etc. But we had to really get into the issues of slow supply. Was it just that the market was slow to react, or was it planning delays and regulations, etc.? So that became a really key focus in that report and in subsequent reports. And I suppose the big thing there was we found quite early on that the restrictive land supply in Auckland was really dominant. So it was very difficult for developers to get a big enough area to make a good large subdivision, and because the land was just being regulated, that they couldn't use land that would otherwise be good for housing. So if the supply can't adjust, then the price goes up.
Interesting. So, as a layperson, when I think about mechanics, they open the bonnet, they want to know why the car works or doesn't work. They'll have a sort of framework in their head. This bit connects to that bit. And similar, like a medical doctor doing a diagnosis on a disease or a condition, they'll have knowledge about the anatomy of the body and how different parts link to be able to identify. I'm sure it's a long answer, it's a pretty complex question, but when I think about the housing market, especially house prices, like what are the different parts or different actors that interact and influence each other? Just to get a picture of, like, when I read something in the newspaper, how does it fit to that system?
Yeah, so if you take the doctor analogy, I first try and think of what is it that that causes the illness in the first place, if you like, and in this case, what is it that causes the increase in population in a place in the first, initially? Why is it that people want to go to Auckland or Tauranga or Queenstown or these sorts of places, which puts the pressure on the housing market to start with? And so we've done a lot of work on what we call amenities, which are either consumption amenities, people like, just makes their quality of life better, or productive amenities which make firms more productive in a particular place. So if places are seen to be improving their amenities, whether it's for the firms or for the people, people will want to go there, and firms will want to go there and create jobs, etc. So what we've seen internationally, as well as in New Zealand, more and more people want to go to sunny places. The better the weather, the more the people want to go there. The closer it is to a lake or the sea, people want to go there. It seems to be that as incomes rise, people really value these things. So we've seen a big drift to the north of the North Island, as well as to places like Queenstown, etc., which have similar sorts of properties. And so we see this increase in population. And that can happen quite quickly. Obviously, people from overseas want to come to the same sorts of places as well, so we see pressure there. And then I think, okay, so that's really the cause of the disease, if you like, to start with. It's a very nice cause of the disease, but it's a cause. How do we fight it? Well, we would fight it by meeting that population with building extra houses. And they could be apartments, it could be standalone dwellings or whatever. So then we've got to think about, well, the planning mechanism. How easy is it for developers to build new houses in a place, just in terms of the regulations? That's a role for councils. And then we have to think about the whole supply chain of building these places. It's all very well to have planning consent, but if you don't have the builders or the materials are expensive, then the cost of housing will be high as well. So if there's restrictive planning practices, we might see high land prices. If there's restrictive materials for building, we might see high construction costs, etc. And these all feed through to the final house. And so that's really sort of the framework I think about it in. You get a population inflow in response to something desirable about a city or a town. And then gradually you get this housing response, but it tends to be very gradual in New Zealand. And some of the reasons, as I mentioned, that for the gradual nature is the planning restrictions. They can be very time consuming, or just straight out banning certain types of development, and it could be height restrictions in a city, or it could be land restrictions. But also we've seen over time shortage of builders, shortage of skilled workers. New Zealand has quite a cyclical building industry. When the downturn comes, people go to Australia. Then the upturn comes and we don't have the builders. So that's been a long history in New Zealand, 20, 30 years, where that happens. We lose our construction workers to Australia, and then, lo and behold, it's very difficult to get construction workers when we need them. And then there is some evidence that the supply chain in materials is pretty expensive as well in New Zealand, although that's probably not a major factor, but it's a minor sort of contributor as well.
Yeah, because when I looked at some historical data, the trends are different. To build a house you need land, you need to pay wages for workers, you need to pay for material. When I looked, last time I looked, and it was years ago, it looked like most things stayed stable, but the price of land skyrocketed. Yeah,
out of all those things, if you think about materials, labour, land is the thing that skyrocketed hugely.
So you can call it the New Zealand land affordability crisis.
Exactly. It's land that's by far the biggest contributor to the increase in house prices that we've seen. But that's reflecting something else. That's reflecting the shortage of new land that's become available in the face of these population pressures that happen. And if you go to a place that doesn't have the population pressures, and may even have lost population when their local town has lost a big employer, you'll find house prices are still very, very cheap in some parts of New Zealand. I mean, I did a study quite a few years ago now, but of Pattaya after it lost its freezing works. And, you could buy a house in Pattaya, or a 3 or 4 bedroom house in Pattaya for sort of less than $50,000. And so you can still get some cheap places in New Zealand where there's not this demand for the land, there's plenty of it.
But that's probably because, there's less work opportunity, like you said. Yeah. It's because less people are interested in living there.
Yeah.
So Arthur, you mentioned you got a background in macroeconomics. So aside from people moving to areas and council react by releasing land and construction worker react by building new houses, are there any other features?
Yeah, well, the macroeconomic side is also important. Obviously, interest rates affect how much people can borrow. So as interest rates have come down over time, we've seen people increasing the amount that they're prepared to pay for a house just because the servicing, mortgage servicing is reduced, obviously with a lower interest rate, so they can afford to borrow more and still have the same, outgoings in terms of interest payments, mortgage payments. So that's been one factor, and with interest rates now extremely low, historically lowest levels ever, that's one factor that's been holding house prices up. And I think that's a little bit of concern from a financial stability point of view, because if we saw interest rates going back up to more normal levels of the last 30, 40 years, there'd be quite a few borrowers who would no longer be able to service their mortgages. So that's going to be one day, a day of reckoning, but it could be a long way off.
Scary.
Mm.
Yeah. What about like you said, the mechanism, the symptom is people moving to an area and then it takes time to react. Can house prices go up even if people don't physically move to an area? Like, for example, if I expect prices to go up and I expect the council and the bills will take 5 years to react. So I think the role of expectations and investments.
Yeah, absolutely. Housing, like many other parts of the economy, is responsive to expectations. And I'll give you an example. We did a study in Auckland where we looked at a new railway upgrade to the Western Line in Auckland. It was announced and it would take about 5 years to fully upgrade the railway. But house prices rose immediately upon the announcement of the railway upgrade because it was going to make easier commuting from the western suburbs of Auckland into the city, double tracking the line so there'd be more frequent services, etc. Rather than waiting until the train came on board. People got in early and bought the houses, but of course that extra pressure on the houses put up their prices.
Yeah. So given all these factors, do you have any thoughts about how we got here to being a fairly unaffordable country? Where in Auckland probably the main factor of if you can afford a house and you're under 40 is how much money your parents have for the deposit. Do you have any thoughts about how we got here? Because it didn't always used to be like that.
No, I mean when I bought my first house, houses were cheap. My first house cost me $39,000 in almost central Wellington. So it's and I pity people trying to buy their first house now. And when I hear talk about an affordable house, and an affordable house is supposedly $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000, it's laughable. That's not affordable for anyone. So how we got here, I think, there's two main parts to it. One is New Zealand has long had immigration, and for a long time we could cope with that. Our cities were very small. We could easily build new suburbs. And there wasn't much of a problem with that. But over time that became more difficult. The land became more difficult to build on, or people had to move further out. There was more pressure to intensify in the cities. And the people who were already there didn't want it. It's a classic NIMBY reaction, not in my backyard. So we had much more lobbying against development. As the population started to grow up, and especially in the major cities, and most notably Auckland. So there's a real political angle here from with a small p, political, from the local community trying to stifle development where they live. And one can understand that. It's if you live in a nice suburb, why would you want more people in that suburb taking away your nice space? And we saw it most recently in the unitary plan discussions in Auckland around the time of the last council elections, when the council, to their credit, actually tried to increase the amount of infill and development, height restrictions, etc., being removed or reduced, and the people in the leafy suburbs in Auckland were successful in countering that. Just a very, very strong lobby. So, we've had the pressures of immigration coming into New Zealand. That's one of the big things. Personally, I think that's a really positive thing for society. Not everyone shares that view, but at a personal level, I think it's great. But we've got these real local political forces that stifle development.
And the shots are being called usually by local councils.
Yeah, and of course the people who vote in local council elections tend to be homeowners. Renters have very, very low turnout in council elections. Councillors know that. They know that they have to keep the house owners happy. House owners don't want pressure in their neighbourhood from other houses encroaching on their area. And of course any housing shortage results in an increase in the house price. So why on earth would a city councillor vote to make housing easily available when their votes come from people who want to make housing more difficult to become available?
So if I'm a council and, I can't intensify, so that I can't build apartments, I can't build more condensed, my only option is to expand. And I guess we've seen this trend in big cities in New Zealand.
Yeah, so, but at the same time, councils were trying to stop expansion as well. So Auckland has got the rural-urban boundary now. It had the metropolitan-urban limit before that. We showed that was hugely important.
What is that?
It was basically a line that the metropolitan-urban limit was a line outside of which you just were not allowed to build any urban activity. So you couldn't build a house, you couldn't build a factory, you couldn't build an office. It was absolutely forbidden. And what we showed at that, some time ago, was that land immediately inside the boundary was worth 10 times as much as land next door to it that was immediately outside the boundary. Exactly the same infrastructure, everything, because they were next door. Same neighbourhood essentially, but they were just next to each other. But the land price was 10 times as high. And the Productivity Commission has since redone that work and found something similar, very, very similar results. And so that kind of restriction was there, supposedly to encourage development to become more intensified in the city, which would have been not so bad, except that there was too many restrictions against intensification in the city. So you stopped people going up in terms of height limits, and you stopped them going out. Well, no wonder that it became very difficult to build new dwellings in response to such a big population influx. Now, I have to say, last week, just very recently, the government has released a national policy statement on urban development, and it divides New Zealand towns and cities up into 3 tiers. And tier 1 are the big cities: Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, etc. And that has basically stated that councils now have to allow development going, I think, unlimited heights within the CBD, the Central Business District, and up to 6 stories high on transit routes and areas sort of quite close to the central city. So, and it has to also have land availability for future housing. So this is a really, really major statement, which could, if it's not stifled by the local planners or councillors, it could go a long way to actually alleviating some of these problems.
Because I heard that some of the problem with expanding is that, you need more roads, and it makes public transport more expensive, because if you spread out, there's less, you need more lines, and there'll be less people per line.
It depends how the expansion happens. So if you look at Wellington compared with Auckland, for instance, Wellington is in a way fortunate. It's built up 2 valleys. You've got the Hutt Valley, and you've got going up to sort of Pororua and to the Kapiti Coast. And so you can actually have 2 railway lines that service these areas, and they can perform that function very, very well, even if the development keeps on going further up the line. It's still just one line coming into the city, so it doesn't actually have problems for public transport. It can even be beneficial for public transport. If if the expansion goes in a circle, pretty much, then you have more problems. But if you look at Auckland, there's plenty of room up the northern motorway between Albany and Orewa, where there's a beautiful motorway and a bus lane and everything else, which would be the obvious place, one obvious place to expand. There's expansion opportunities down towards Hamilton in terms of the railway line that's been looked at, to opening up a passenger rail line between Hamilton and Auckland. So there's plenty of opportunities. It just took a little bit more. The thing I like actually about that latter example is Pocono. And for anyone who knows Auckland, there's a town now called Pocono, which is just over the Bombay Hills, which is in the Waikato area. So it didn't face the regulatory restraints of Auckland Council, and it's now growing just huge. I mean, every time you go past it, there's hundreds more houses there. It's just enormous, and it's what economists would call a regulatory arbitrage. It's just, this is sort of essentially South Auckland, but because it's governed by Waikato, it can actually grow. So it could easily be serviced by a train line from there through to Auckland, and that wouldn't be such a damaging expansion.
Interesting. Are there, going back again to high house prices, so aside from the direct effect, which means that it's not affordable for a lot of people, are there any other problems for the economy? The fact that you get very expensive houses? And I guess I'm thinking about like big cities.
Well, I think there's two or three big issues. One is at a social level, one gets not only just poverty but also crowding. So we see poorer families really crowding into a particular house. You may have two or three households and two or three families in the one house. That has terrible problems in terms of disease, infections, etc. It's really problematic for kids doing their homework and schoolwork and things like that. So it has very, very major social problems, as well as just living on top of each other the whole time, which can't be great for family sort of situations. So that's one area. Another area is it's starting to make it very difficult to attract people to Auckland, for instance. So if you are a firm, Auckland is much more productive than the rest of the country for many types of industries. But it's increasingly difficult to attract people there because of the high cost of housing. So if people, for instance, have an option of getting a job somewhere else, they may well do so. So one can think, I know the education industry well, for instance, that it's now becoming much more difficult to attract lecturers and professors and things like that to Auckland University or these universities as opposed to a university somewhere else in the country, which is much cheaper to live. At another level, you think about teachers, and it's now very difficult to employ teachers in parts of Auckland because it's just too expensive for teachers to live, right? So they would go off to other parts of New Zealand. And so schools around Auckland are now finding it very difficult to actually attract, teachers, but obviously you need teachers if there's kids there. So it's this is becoming, quite a major issue for some industries now.
Is that necessarily a problem though? I mean, if workers decide, okay, well, I'll go to Hamilton, I'll go to Hawke's Bay, as opposed to Auckland, is it a problem? Maybe it will create a more equal society, which still is spread more across the country? Yeah,
it's a natural sort of dynamic, if you like, that as one place becomes very expensive, people will move out and go to other places. I think it is a problem when for a couple of reasons. One is essential workers, people like teachers, etc. I mean, you can't do without them. So that is a problem. And the second is that for cultural reasons, people like to be near other people of their own culture. And so once you've got a culture that's dominantly in one city, those people don't want to move out somewhere else. And so they're likely to put up with very, very poor living conditions and the crowding and that sort of thing. Because if they had to leave where their extended family is and cultural relationships are, they would move somewhere where they felt completely out of place. So they tend to be the people that are most hardest hit. And if you look in Auckland, I think it's quite clear that the Pacific Island community is just dreadfully affected by the very, very high house prices. Because they're much less likely to want to move to somewhere else.
Yeah, and I remember a few years ago there was a previous government plan to pay people, I think in social housing, there was a shortage of social housing, so we'll pay you to go to somewhere else, so we got extra social housing. And I don't think many did, or maybe they came back.
Yeah, and again, if you're in that situation and let's say you're a solo parent and you're in a state house, but all your support network is there, you're probably going to be worse off moving somewhere else where you don't have a support network, even if financially you're better off. So I think those social ties make it really difficult for some people, and often disadvantaged people, to move easily away from an expensive city.
Mm. And I guess people don't have to move to other parts of New Zealand. Maybe they move overseas.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. Auckland is the 5th largest city in Australasia, so it's not a large city. But people can move from Auckland to Brisbane, or they can move to Melbourne or Sydney or Perth, and people do, as well as obviously moving further afield. So if Auckland prices itself out of the housing market, then not just the people will move, but the firms will move as well.
And the opportunities.
Mm. Yeah, because there's great opportunities in Australia.
So, taking all this into account, how do we make housing affordable again? Or can we? Or is it too late?
No, I don't think it's too late, but it will take a long time. It's not going to be easy just to get house prices down fast, unless the Reserve Bank suddenly decides to put interest rates back up about 5 percentage points. And they're not going to do that in a hurry. So I think there has to be a really concerted effort to ease the planning regulations in our larger cities, and I think this national policy statement that's just been released is going to go some way towards that. Interestingly, also the RMA review panel, Resource Management Act review panel, has just reported back with some similar ideas in some ways to extend spatial planning to enable adequate room for housing to come through. So I think there are some pressures now that are coming through at the central government level to improve things. But it's going to require also a very large house building program. Now, the Kiwi Build was meant to be that, but it was done at the wrong time. It was done at a time when every builder in the country was double booked already, not just single booked. It was never going to succeed when there was no spare builders. You can't build more houses if there's no builders. Now we've got the situation where construction workers, etc., are looking for jobs. I would tend to, rather than looking at building the private sector sort of housing like Kiwi Build, have a much larger state housing build program, which both increases the stock of housing overall, which is beneficial, but also targets the people most in need. So that's, Kaiangaora is thinking in those terms, and government's thinking in those terms. But I think it's really important now to be ramping up the whole state house build.
Do you have any thoughts about, one thing that the Labour government did was restrict foreigners from buying houses. I think if I just follow the media, I would think that's why house prices are expensive, because overseas investors bought all our houses. And I think there was a documentary a few years ago, Who Owns New Zealand, that raised that proposition. Do you think that helped, or?
No, I think it was almost a trivial response, really, to be honest. I mean, I think the ownership of the issue is not who owns the house. The issue is how many houses are there relative to the number of people who want to live in them. The ownership is only, I'd say, sort of a fairly trivial wrinkle on that. And changing the ownership rules, I think, made almost no difference.
Mm. So coming to an election, one of the parties, Opportunities parties, so it's a bit on the side. They suggested, well, they have a lot of policies, but part of the package is taxing assets or taxing wealth. I hope I'm getting at the details right. And it sounds a bit similar to the capital gain tax that was recommended. Do you think that's part of the solution, or is it just creating a new problem?
Yes, well, I've long advocated a land tax to replace income tax, or to reduce income tax, and we should be taxing land instead. That would have the immediate effect of reducing the land price. It doesn't actually change affordability of housing as such, because you would have a reduced land price, but then you would have an annual tax on the land, and the present discounted value of these things that value over time would actually equate. But for in terms of the upfront cost of a house, that would come down, and it would be like your house price came down, but your rates, including land tax, would go up, and that would make it easier for younger people entering the market, because they wouldn't have to have such a big deposit anymore to get in, and provided they had sufficient income or future rises in income, they'll be able to afford the land tax. It's got also a lot of other beneficial properties from an economic sort of point of view. It doesn't distort the market. So I would concentrate on the land tax side rather than the broader wealth side. I'm not opposed to wealth taxes, but they're actually very difficult to implement, because it's very difficult to define wealth other than land.
Yeah. And what about capital gain tax?
Well,
Is it the same thing?
The nice thing about a land tax is essentially it replaces a capital gains tax, and especially if one can design it in such a way that you actually tax the increment in the land price as opposed to the whole land price. And that idea goes back to the 1870s, I think. John Stuart Mill, one of the greatest economists of all time, advocated taxing the increment in land value. He argued that that was due to community decisions, allowing more people in or whatever. That shouldn't accrue to the landowner; it should accrue to society. So that was his argument. I think it's got a lot going for it.
So you mentioned people will be deterred moving to an area because of high house prices. What kind of other effects will it have?
Well, that can have productivity effects in a city. So
What's productivity?
So productivity is how much we produce per person employed, essentially. So if we can produce more, greater output per person, then we can all become richer. So good higher productivity is beneficial, because there's more to go around. And what we know from the international literature and also the studies that have been done by some of my colleagues on New Zealand is that the places that have the highest productivity tend to be the cities, the larger cities. And we call this an agglomeration effect. As the cities become agglomerated, they become larger, they become more productive. Now, if people are deterred from going to the larger cities, this then stops them from getting that extra benefit that we see when more people congregate together and increase productivity. And there are many different channels for that, but they all come from the idea that the more people there are in a city, the more chance we get to learn from each other, the better matches there are in terms of skills to firms and that sort of thing. So right throughout the world we see larger cities are more productive than smaller ones. But if people are deterred from going to those places because of high house prices, then we don't get that advantage of the productivity benefits, which means our income per person becomes lower.
Not just in Auckland, but all across the country.
Yeah, exactly. So the effect is initially in Auckland, but of course that spreads out.
And that will translate to less taxes and less availability of money for social services or roads or...
Absolutely. I mean, people often forget that our health services and our education services and all these things, our pensions, etc., are all paid through from taxes of people who are earning income.